last front row here.
Let's tone it down. Bring it down a couple times. Because it goes to 11. Then we have to go to 11.
All right, here we go. Last row. A couple people, I think, oh, Ray just came in. There's a couple people back there, Clay. Just two that came in.
Raise your hand if you did not. Oh.
Oh, a few more, sorry.
So keep your hands up. 1, 2, 3 on this side.
One right behind you, Clay.
I'm doing one side at a time.
Anthony, feel free to just reach over.
I may defer to you on that.
All right.
Okay, there's 3 people over here. 1. Okay. We got plenty of
And
time.
one in the back there, Clay. Okay, we're almost
Right
done.
here. Go. Okay, in the back. All right. Who else needs one? Are we good yet? Okay, I got one.
All right, we're ready to get started. Thanks, Clay.
Hey, look, they're all
Pop it
randomly
right over
mixed
there.
up here.
Pop it right over there.
Right here. Everybody can
Perfect.
see them.
Thanks. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this panel. My name is Anthony Keith, and I will give you just my quick history here with this gentleman. I worked with him for almost 15 years at the San Diego Comic-Con. I started as a gopher for him, and that's what they used to call it. If you were under 13, you couldn't work security, so I had to work my first year as a gopher. And then the next year I worked as security, and I continued on with Gene for another 12 or so years. So I've known him a long time, and his wife, Mary, as well. She was what we would call our con mom. She was amazing. She managed to squeeze more kids into the free volunteer con rooms than you could possibly imagine. I think we were piled on top of each other in the beginning days, but that's how they had to do it. So I will give you a little bit now of Gene's background. Gene founded the Orange County Science Fiction and Fantasy Art Show. He sponsored the West Coast Comic Club for 45 years. He was instrumental in the creation of the San Diego Comic-Con's Russ Manning Award. He is a recipient of Comic-Con International's prestigious Inkpot Award. And to top it off, last year, Gene became the first person in Comic-Con's history to receive an Emeritus title. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Eugene Henderson. Okay, so why don't we start, Gene, with a little bit of background that you can give the audience as to how you became a comic fan and how you got involved in fandom.
Well, when I was born,
They put a comic book in my hand.
when I was born during the Long Beach earthquake of '33, that was the year that comic books first came out. That was the Famous Funnies that first came out. A few years later, Famous Funnies '33 #1 came out, and that was the beginning of the newsstand comic books. And I wasn't allowed to have comic books when I was a kid because the churches said they were evil, and they were partly right. Even Frederick, that's where I get the booze, even Frederick Werther was partly right. He was also partly wrong too. So starting out that way, not being allowed to read them. Then one time when I bought a comic, after we moved to San Diego, I was born in Los Angeles. I lived on Avalon Boulevard, just south of Manchester. Some of you from Los Angeles area know what that is. And traffic was mild, enough to kill our cats, but not enough to kill us. And nowadays I wouldn't try to get on Avalon Boulevard. Anyway, we moved to San Diego. Lemon Grove is kind of a town where if you blink your eyes, you missed it. And there was one drugstore in there. That's the drugstore that carried the comic books. And many's the time I stood there looking at the comic books, wishing I could buy one. I didn't have the dime. Dimes were scarce. So anyway, finally one day I bought a comic book on a sly, And the kids next door told my mother, figured that she'd give them the book. She sat down and read it. It was Batman, #7. And she said, there's nothing wrong with this. He's a pretty good guy. So I got to read comics. She didn't know about some of the other characters.
So, along the way, you, at some point, I understand, felt it necessary to write a letter to DC. You want to talk about that?
Well, I was kind of irked at, I think it was issue 15 where they had the Caverns of Deadly Spears. And I didn't like the way they made it into one of their favorite, what do they call it, never stories, where the characters were all thinking, well, this is what we remembered happened and all that sort of thing. And they lost a good villain there, and I was kind of irked about it, so I wrote and told them, never thinking that they would publish the letter. And they did the next issue. And then all of a sudden I got a letter from Jerry Bales, one of the founders of Comic Fandom. And he says, welcome to Fandom. And he says, I'm surprised that you haven't met the McGeehan brothers, House of Info. They're big in Fandom. He says they only live right in the same city you do.
Why don't you tell them who the McGeehan brothers were, just because some people may not know and their involvement.
John and Tom McGeehan were two brothers that founded what is known as the House of Info. Books were sent to them, and they evaluate them, mainly fanzines and all that. So John had a system: good, buy it. Going on down to finally you get the last one for those with charitable inclinations or relatives of the author. And there were plenty of those. Because he let me go through, and I was supposed to photograph a lot of the stuff. So I photographed a lot of the stuff, and fortunately, I think the slides all got lost. So I don't have anything left on that. Anyway, John McGeehan didn't have any transportation. I had a car. So one time he said, would you like to go meet some fans? I said, other fans. I said, that sounds okay. Where? Long Beach. So we drove to Long Beach, and there was the home of Rick Durrell, who was a big collector. People out there were Mike Royer. Can't think of all the others that were there. Anyway, people in Fandom. We had a big picture taken, which later showed up in Alter Ego. And everybody looked at it and thought, well, he must be a big fan. He was out there with all the others. And I hardly knew him, but that was it. Then finally, John McGeehan said, well, Gene, would you mind taking me to a con? I said, what's a con? He says, Comic Con, convention, convention.
And what year was this, Gene?
This was in 1971, first con.
First con was 70, so it was this.
It was going as a Golden State Comics convention. So I said, okay, yeah, I'll take you down there. So we got down. I didn't know that he knew everybody there. And I didn't know he was going to introduce me to everybody there. And all they could think of was more meat. So,
and just so you know, the one he's referring to was held at the U.S. Grand Hotel on Broadway, downtown, in the basement, in this little tiny room, little tiny like banquet room that they had down there. And that was the first one that they had. A lot of the kids were like 17 years old. Steve Jeppy, that now runs Diamond Comics, he had a little table when he was 17 there. So a lot of the people that started, Richard Alf and others as well. So that was the one he's referring to.
I felt kind of out of place. I was old. So,
so you did that, and then I believe you told me something about asking your wife Mary to go to.
Well, I'll tell you that one. After the first con, that's where I first met. By the way, where I first met Jack Kirby. He was just leaving. I was coming in. I said, "Would you sign this book?" Well, the book happened to be Steranko's History of Comics, and Jack says, "I haven't got it." His wife said, "You haven't got yours yet, Jack. How come he's got one?" I said, "I didn't tell him that John got it because he was supposed to evaluate it. He sold it to me." So I gave it to Jack. Jack sat down and went through and looked through it, read it, and then signed it, autographed it to me. And that's one of the only 2 autographs I ever bothered getting.
And wasn't there another Jack story about your son driving Jack and didn't know who he was?
That later.
No, tell about that though.
Well, we were.
The con's about Jack this year, so Jack stories are good.
Well, Jack was coming down to judge our art show, which we had, and him and Roz, they needed a way down because Roz wasn't up to driving, and Jack did not drive because he'd be driving along thinking of something, go through a red light, pull over, and so Mary and I were both tied up, so we sent our son up to drive him, and years later, he was talking to some fellows at work, and they said, you know, did you see this great picture of Thor? And Les said, yeah, I saw that at Jack's home when I was at Jack's home. You knew Jack Kirby? And they were bowing to him and everything like that.
He had no idea who he had in the car.
So he was a big celebrity.
So, on the convention start, you and Mary, initially you just attended, right, the first year?
Yeah, you didn't get to the story. I asked Mary.
Oh, sorry, you skipped that. Sorry. Thank you. Go ahead. That's
Jumped
right.
ahead of me a couple
I'm sorry.
couple
You threw me off with the Kirby story coming early. See, I had it down here, so. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Anyway, the second year I was in the car, I was going to go pick up John. Mary was standing at the door waving me by. I said, Mary, would you like to go? And to my horror, she said, yes. So I knew that I've been told that cons tend to break up marriages. The wives get kind of fed up with it. But Mary said, yeah, I'll go along. And we dragged our son along too. He was underage, so he went down yelling and screaming. Then when we left, he was yelling and screaming when we dragged him out of the film room. But anyway, Mary went down there, and Kirk Allen was doing a talk.
And just so you know, Kirk Allen was the first TV Superman.
No, he was
I'm sorry, movie Superman, thank you.
And he was an old charmer, so Mary said, oh, this is great, these people are great. And she just started me, Mary was a people person. Me, I was a thing person. I liked comic books and collecting them and whatnot, and even soldiers. And Mary was people. She didn't care about the comic books. In fact, she hated the comic books, except for Drew. She thought that was fun. But anyway, both of us ended up in Comic-Con. That's how she got down there.
So
That's her up there, by the way, on the picture.
that's Mary right up there. I don't know if you can even recognize that is Jean, just so in case you didn't know. Just tell.
I think of gained a little weight since then.
So, okay, now we're at the con. So let's talk about your evolution, yours and Mary's evolution in Comic-Con. Go ahead and give them an idea, starting when you started with them as a volunteer.
Well, we met everybody, and they asked us to do something, go someplace. We had a car, or would you drive us someplace? That was it. And they liked my station wagon because we could put more people in it. And Mary, she was willing to do anything. Finally, the one year we came there, and it says, is there anything else you need us for this year? And Shell says, yes, our registrar has called in sick, couldn't make it. Can you take over? So the next thing we know, we were on registration. We made sure we wouldn't get stuck on that one again later. But, so that's how we ended up getting on the committee and starting our careers. Mary played it kind of cool. She didn't want any leadership positions. So she just kind of helped out in the background. Myself, I was a little more ambitious. They made me print, I don't know how I put that, in charge of the print media. So anyway, I'd write letters, and magazines just ignored us. The newspapers were just ignoring us. Usually we got a mention on the back pages of the local paper. So the reporter came down to the dealer's room. I said, boy, I hope they don't get 20th Century Fox doesn't know about this. And she says, oh, why? And I said, well, all this bootleg Star Wars material is here. This was the year Star Wars. Star Wars is here. Oh, really? The next day on the front page of our local paper, I couldn't remember what the Tribune or the Journal. Anyway, it said, bootleg Star Wars material at Comic-Con. Our attendance doubled that year. So then the next job I took, I only took that 1 year. I figured that was enough. So the next year I wanted to run for dealer's room, well, security. And the thing that really bothered me was that the dealer's room in those days, at night, everything was packed into boxes and taken home, or taken out to their cars and everything, because people were afraid to leave them. There were a few brave souls that put a cloth over their books and then prayed that no one would steal them at night. So my first job when I became security was to make sure that dealer's room was safe. So we'd lock it down at night. We eventually put a guard in there, a big whom I told, you're in charge here, if anything's missing, you're responsible. Boy, did he check those doors. And no one could get in, except the dealer's coordinator, which was later Tom French, who is deceased now, but he was a great dealer's room coordinator, probably one of the best. We worked together real well. And myself and him were the only two that could get in. We had a signal. And the main reason for this, and this isn't knocking the guy any, but Sheldorf had a bad habit of taking his friends around and showing them things that no one else could do. And our fear was that he'd take a whole group in there some night into the dealer's room and show them around. And I could just see the next day the dealers tearing their hair out, vowing never to come back. And remember, if you can't hear me, do this. That way I can talk up. I hope I'm talking up loud. I've never gotten used to these things. So I used to think they were candy when someone handed me one. But anyway.
So you went along and got involved with security, and then at what point did you evolve to the board?
Well, there was a board. We were all on the board at first. We became a nonprofit.
501c.
Private profit. And Shell said, well, we're a private profits corporation. And how that came about, they went to see, the Peanuts guy.
Charles Schultz, yeah.
Charles Schultz. And the Peanuts guy. Anyway, everybody knew who I meant. Anyway, he said, well, I only do cons for free, if you're a nonprofit. And Shell said, well, we're nonprofit. That's how we became nonprofit. And really, we were nonprofit before that anyway. So.
You are getting inside info on the con. A lot of people didn't know that one.
Anyway, so we had to organize as a corporation. So the first one was Shell and Richard. Well, Shell nominated Richard. Richard nominated Shell for president, vice president.
He's referring to Richard Butner.
Richard Butner, who was really a good vice president. Executive vice president for years, and he had a lot to do with organizing many things in the con. But anyway, they nominated themselves, and they nominated all the people for the different positions, and all we had to do was rubber stamp it. And we were really doing a good job. Toot-toot, we could hear the train running through. So that's how we got organized. Well, at first, everybody was on the board. They said, you're all on the board. That was a pretty big board, too. So gradually, it got down to the point where a new regime came in. That was the regime of John Rogers, who, by the way, is largely responsible for our great success and great organization. He knew how to handle people. He knew when to let them alone and do their job. He knew who to pick. And also, he paid attention to detail, and just about any major new idea came from him. And we're very fortunate to have it.
John Rogers, if anybody doesn't know, is the president of the San Diego Comic-Con, and he's been in that position for over a couple decades.
So anyway, worked from here, but about that time I left security and turned it over here to Anthony. I think you lasted a year.
Yeah, I lasted a year. I learned to greatly appreciate his job. I could never figure out how he managed to look like
Grant. Then we were out there at Scripps.
Sheraton, right? Wasn't it?
Sheraton on the Bay.
Yeah.
But at Scripps,
And then Scripps, yeah.
there, second.
Or no, the third year was El Cortez, I'm sorry. Fourth year was at the Sheraton.
At the Sheraton, right? Yeah.
So we moved around. I think the reason we were at the Sheraton is because somebody threw yellow dye in the swimming pool at the El Cortez. So anyway, finally the El Cortez.
They let us back, fortunately.
Yeah, it was, and that was fun. Everybody remembered the fun so much so that when we had to move our location down to the new convention center in the heart of town, a lot of people didn't like that, and they said, well, we should go back to that. another minor split. The one reason, if we split or had a disagreement, some people wanted to leave, the con continued on with the same leadership and everything, because we were a nonprofit. There was no money to fight over. And you might say, well, where's the money? Well, we can't touch it. The state says we can't touch it. If we try, we're going to go to jail. So no one wanted to go to jail. So we left the money where it was. And of course, usually the idea of a nonprofit was true. One year we had $15,000 stolen. And that put a change. I said, from now on, no more of this carrying the money around in a sack and hanging from your belt. And
Yeah,
so
you just try to imagine that our executive vice president just took all the cash with him, just the same way you put your wallet in your pocket and go away. That was not the wise move. But what because that money was stolen, what did the con manage to do to be able to get enough money to put another convention on? Do you remember?
no, they had some kind of a little fund.
Was it 3-day?
I think it was a 3-day.
Yeah, they threw together a quick. They just kind of threw together a quick. Go ahead, Clayton.
Yeah, I was part of that. At our committee meeting, the announcement was made the money was gone. And that was the budget for next year's convention.
Right.
And so Shel Dorf, the president, wrote an editorial, an ad in the Comics Buyer's Guide. Put his picture in there. Thank you everybody for coming. And oh, by the way, we're sorry to report that all our funds are gone. And to make it up, we're hosting another one at the El Cortez. It was November 4th, 5th, and 6th. And it was just like a weekend mini-con. And it was just like a regular con. People showed up, we had guests, we made the money back.
And the nice thing, the reason that story is very important is because it just showed that even at that time, the love essentially being given to the con, being unique and being something that people really enjoyed, that they were willing to do that. And that's what allowed the con to continue, because it could easily have floundered, not having had that money.
And again, this is like September, October for a November event.
Right.
And it made enough money to carry on. And again,
Right.
it was all about that good
Right.
the relationship.
Yeah, exactly. So Gene,
Another little side on
go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Jim Shooter, who was editor-in-chief at Marvel at the time, went before the board and asked them if they would bail us out. And they agreed to. All we had to do was send in a police report. No one ever sent in a police report.
Really?
Well, there's a little extra story. See, a lot of inside stuff here. I didn't even know that. First time I'm hearing this.
I hear a lot of things.
Interesting. I know you have. I know you have.
In fairness,
Too much already.
in fairness to the people, it was 1975. And the bank opened at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. And this was Sunday night. And they
Right.
were home with
Right. We finished Sunday nights, right?
I'm just saying, there was nowhere to go.
So, Gene, going back to the Alcatraz for a minute. Let's stick with that for a minute. Just thinking about Comicfest, one of the things that Mike had told me when he talked about he and Richard Alf. Richard Alf was co-founder of the San Diego Comic Con with Shel Dorf. And one of the things Mike Towery mentioned to me in the very beginning, Comicfest, the first one, was that he and Richard wanted to create something that was similar to what we had back when we started, when I was a teenager, at the Comic-Con. And that's leading into what I wanted to have you talk about, Gene, is in terms of getting autographs, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, how hard was it back in those days to get an autograph? How much money did it cost?
Oh, it was even free.
Free.
The guests were still in awe. They didn't realize how important they were to the fans, and so they were still grateful to them. And the easiest one to get to was Jack Kirby.
Try to imagine that today.
One fan wrote in a book how easy it was. Jack, he came to Marvel during the weekend up while I was back in New York, and he went to the building. There was no one around. He went down a corridor and finally saw a little closet at the end. He went down there, and it was Jack Kirby working. Jack stopped what he was doing talked to the guy, and then took him to lunch. That's the kind of person Jack Kirby was.
It was a very different time in terms of people knew what the Comic-Con created was the ability for the kids that loved and the adults that loved comics to come and get to see the faces of people that they had no knowledge of, inkers, colorists, the writers, all of these people that were just faceless to them were able to connect and basically, you know, become celebrities in and of themselves. And that's really what Comic-Con did. It brought together the fans with the people that created the books.
Yeah. I got to meet a lot of people that I never thought I'd meet. Vern Hogarth, who'd done the Tarzan strip when I was a kid. One of the great artists of our time. I thought he was dead. Here he was alive and telling us how the comic books were through. They wouldn't last another 10 years. That was 40-some years. Anyway, they've been burying comic books for years.
And in terms of timelines with the ability to you know, spend day or night, the El Cortez, what about, you want to talk about people on 3 in the morning at the El Cortez pool? Can people do that anymore?
Yeah, I had, no, we can't do that anymore. We outgrew the El Cortez years ago, centuries ago. Anyway, when they had the pool time, I was upstairs above them, second floor above them, and Mary says, "Are you going to shut them down?" I said, "You want to get killed?" Anyway, they'd go out there and have a grand old time. I think some of the kids were drinking beer.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
He finally confessed.
They had people diving off the balconies into the pool.
yeah.
Oh,
Bear in mind, it was the 70s, and in addition to that, Con was still new, so the hotel just kind of let Con do its thing. And you could go out, and I did, as a teenager. I can still remember going out 2, 3 in the morning, and you would see Jack or Stan Lee or Sergio Aragonés or George Clayton Johnson just sitting there by the pool talking. I mean, you can't even imagine that today.
The pool was a nucleus for the con.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ray, the gentleman talking now worked with Gene and I also in security for forever, basically, and he after I left, he took over security. Okay, so El Cortez, where did we go next, Gene?
Well, the next thing, the El Cortez, well, we were still having meetings at the El Cortez, but we were no longer used the convention. We were using back to the
Hotel San Diego and Civic Center.
the Hotel San Diego. I'd like to forget about that. 2 of our comedians once said
Apparently the city wanted to too because they tore it down.
they were tearing down another building across the street. And the guy said, "It's great to watch all these hordes of little cockroaches coming across. San Diego Hotel or bust." And really, you can have cockroach fights, cockroach races, and if you're really hungry, you could cook cockroaches for dinner. And,
So we grew out of the El Cortez. The con grew to the Civic Center, and the events we also had events at the Hotel San Diego and the Westgate. At that time, about how many people would you estimate were attending when we moved over to the Civic Center?
well, we were running into the thousands. There's no way for me to tell them. It was growing everywhere, and we didn't keep records to that
Yeah,
effect.
in the beginning, yeah.
Or at least records that I got to see. So we didn't really. We were growing steadily, but not spectacularly, and it was getting big. And then finally, we outgrew the Civic Center downtown.
So when would you recall when you moved? The convention moved over to the convention center.
I think it was in the 80s.
We moved to the hotel and down by the Sardinia
You get at
first.
my
and then
age,
the conventions.
you tend to forget about the years. You like to forget about the years. But anyway, the 80s we moved over. We took over the first section, which was section A. Then we took over B. Then D. Pretty soon we almost outgrown the hotel. Then the one year, Marvel pulled out. By this time, I was no longer security. I was on the board. And I was actually vice president. I forget about that. Sometimes I forget that I was vice president.
Yeah, I was wondering when you get to that, but that's, you know, I thought you'd take your time.
I was vice president for 2 years, and it was the year that we moved over to the new convention center. And we figured this will keep it for the next 10 years. We'll be all right. And then then I was back to being the assistant to the dealers coordinator, Tom French. I was his assistant, or one of his assistants. And then Marvel pulled out. They said, announced they weren't coming back to the con. You know, that was our death knell. We figured, well, that's going to be rough. It turned out to be our biggest year. The lines were clear up from the convention center way around to Seaport Village. First time we'd ever seen that. I can see Frank sitting on the front row, register there, but everyone was flat inundated.
Yeah, and that speaks volumes when you consider that, you know, Marlboro was so big, but the con by that time, would you say, had just kind of become its own identity?
I would say so. People still flocked. Hollywood had found it. A friend of mine, I won't give his name, but he's publisher, still does about 24 pages a week of comic art, and producer of films, which we can't show in the United States. And anyway, he came down. He's a great self-publisher. He could get himself into the newspapers. So he came down with a group of models at his table, and he brought down the press, the television group. And they were sitting there taking pictures. And then they started looking around at the con. They couldn't even see the end. And they called up north and said, you better send some people down here because this thing is big. So that's how, one of the ways we got the press down there. And anyway, that next year when we came there, Hollywood discovered us. Oh, look, there's lots of people here for we can exploit. Or I mean, show new films too. And make a little loop on the side. So that's when we started getting into the press, the newsreels, television, and we took off. We just grew. We outgrew the convention center. We started using the hotels as extra places to show films or have different venues. Then we started using, I believe didn't we start using the baseball place next door?
The Petco Bar.
Yeah, did we start using some of that? I think we did. Yeah.
So you just trying to picture, we started the little tiny banquet room and grew to, you know, now what, 150,000 people attending this convention.
We had 500 attendants the first year.
Right. So a question that comes to mind with what you're just talking about, was there ever a particular time that you know, were at the convention and you kind of stood there and said, holy moly, how did it get this big? Was there ever a year that you just realized just how big it grew? Was it when you moved over to the convention center?
Yes. Every year I looked up there and I'd say, oh my goodness, where are we going to go next? What are we going to do? We're coming out at the seams. Well, it seems they put up tents on the back lot. They'd use the other hotels. And we're actually, Comic-Con is scattered quite around San Diego. We really are the San Diego Comic-Con. Hotels are using their lobbies, their rooms. We have even had to come up with a bus system. A lot of people don't know this, but those shuttles are free, and Comic-Con does pay for them. So don't think that the bus service has given us free bus service because of goodness of their heart. The goodness of their heart is the gray
Money
and
they get
green,
paid.
the good old gray and green that we throw down in front of them.
And what is interesting about the situation that happened recently with the Chargers here in San Diego, just thought you'd be interested to know, you know, when the city looks at it between losing the Chargers and potentially losing the Comic-Con, the Comic-Con brings in close to $100 million during its week. The Chargers never brought that much money in a year. So, you know, they're happy to keep the con here. Okay, all right, Gene.
Something too about the Padres.
No?
Oh, the Padres once told us that didn't matter, they were going to hold their games opposite Comic-Con. They tried it one year.
People learned a valuable
People
lesson.
couldn't even find a place to park to get to the game, so next year they made sure that they never came opposite us again.
So we're going to wrap up in a sec here, but I just want to have you finish, Gene, before we take questions.
You want to hear about the robbery and everything? Okay.
Oh, I hear about that. I just thought it'd be nice to kind of just throw out what you told me. You know, in the times at the Comic-Con, you have a lot of opportunities to rub shoulders and to spend time, you know, with a lot of people that have become very famous in the industry now. But again, they had notoriety at the time, but not at the level they do today. But some people even back then, let's just say, saw the advantage of their notoriety. And one of them that Gene told me a story about was Bob Kane and people going to. You want to tell them about that?
Well, actually,
Bob Kane, by the way, created Batman.
co-creator of Batman.
Bill Finger. We got to mention Bill Finger.
Anyway, it was Sheldon Moldorf was telling us at one of the meetings. He said that Bob Kane was a handsome man, good and all that, but he was the cheapest guy you ever saw. He'd stick people go to dinner and stick them with a check. And he said, I ran into him after the war, and I used to work for him. He ghosted a lot of Batman for him. And so he said, well, Joel, let's go have dinner. So he said, come on, I'll take you to dinner. So he took me to dinner. And then when we get to dinner, he says, I left my wallet at home. I don't have any money. And Shell says, oh, that's okay, Bob. I got a lot of money out in the car. Yeah, I'll go get it. And he said, that's the last time I ever saw Bob.
Shell got Bob back for all those don't have my wallet things. I just love that story. So, okay.
He reminded me of that.
Okay, we're going to open up the floor. We have a few minutes left before we'll do the drawing. And don't worry if you came in and you didn't get a ticket. Before we do the drawing, Clayton will get you a ticket real quick if you raise your hand in a minute. But right now, we're going to open the floor to questions. Any questions for Gene? None at all? Huh? Oh, back there. We have one back there.
Who took that money?
We don't. If we knew that, we would have got the money back probably. That's
Snatch and grab, purse snatching?
I had my suspicions of who did it. Things pointed to the person, but I had no proof, so I didn't say anything. I told John later, I'm pretty sure you did it, but without proof, you don't even mention their names, because they can sue. So,
What year was this again? Do you remember?
75. Was that 75, right? 75, I believe.
You garnered $15,000 in 1975
More like.
on the competing convention income.
that would,
Take a guess.
well, that's okay, they didn't know. Yeah, that would be, and that was our whole operating
Yeah,
cost for
that's
the
what I'm
next
talking
year.
about.
So,
Any other questions?
we still had bills to pay, by the way.
I was thinking that, yeah.
Any other questions? Are we good? Okay. Couple quick things. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. You got a question?
How do you feel about Comic-Con kind of like getting away from comics and incorporating out movies and TV shows and stuff like that? Do you think we should? You hear what he's about?
I think how we get to it. Is the question how we get, how we feel about getting away from comics and going into other areas?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you something about Comic-Con. When we started, it wasn't just comic books. It was science fiction. A lot of people didn't know this. We had a lot of science fiction guests. The Heinlein Blood Drive was named after a science fiction writer. Also, movies. We all were into movies and television. So actually, we never have really gotten away from comic books. They're still there, and comics books are still in. Well, in the movies, how many of you have seen a Marvel movie recently? What? No, Hannah, only.
No, come on. That's a good question.
Either that or a bunch of people are telling the truth.
Okay. Quick question, Gene, and then we're going to go ahead and
I just wanted to interject something to add to that. Our first logo, we were called Golden State Comic Con. Our first logo was the state of California with 3 circles. Each one was comics, one was science fiction, and the other one was films. And that's how it's always been since the beginning. It hasn't always been focused solely on comic books.
So Gene, tell us, who's your favorite superhero? I know.
I have no qualms about saying my favorite hero is Captain Marvel.
There you go.
Not the one you got today. Captain Marvel, the world's mightiest mortal, who outsold Superman by $730 million.
There you go.
The reason I know that is because DC, that's what DC claimed they were losing.
Okay,
Captain Marvel.
is there anything else you'd like to say to the audience today? Any last thing you'd like to say?
Well, I'd like to say that it's safe to keep coming to Comic-Con. We have great security. It's no longer handled by volunteers. We had to go professional on that. The security force is made up of people that are Marines from the base that wanted to get extra money, police officers that wanted to get extra money, and professional volunteers of the security forces. People are very confident, and they keep us safe.
Anything else you'd like to say to the audience, just about Comic-Con? Any insight tip you can give?
Well, I'm kind of old now, and I'm out of positions. I don't have to lose any positions. So I thought I might tell you how to get free passes to the Comic-Con.
Gene, you can say.
Okay, anybody doesn't have a ticket? We got 1 minute. Anybody? We're going to do the drawing. Gene's going to draw very quickly.